Sorry, my mic was off. If we can get that started.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, my name is Tram Huang. I'm a senior associate at Policy Link. I apologize for not being able to attend your work session in person. As Councilmember Mitchell might have mentioned, I am doing a bit of traveling for work and am generally based in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. But today I'm actually recording this call from Los Angeles. So I really deeply appreciate the opportunity to support your work from afar. And I will be screen sharing and presenting a brief presentation on rent stabilization and a little bit of data on what renters in Laurel, specifically Prince George's County, since that's the level of data that I have access to at Policy Link, and sharing a bit of information about policies for you, especially policies that have been passed across the country, because as you know, many cities across the country are grappling with this issue, and many are turning to rent stabilization policies to help alleviate a portion of the housing crisis for renters. So with that, I will do a quick screen share and begin my presentation. Before I do that, just want to note that I will have my contact information on the final slide. Encourage you all to write down any questions you may have. Please feel free to put those together either and email them to me, and I will hopefully attend a future meeting virtually, a city council meeting or work session, so that I can answer those questions for you all. And again, thanks for the opportunity to present from afar. All right, so let me get my slides up. Okay, great. Okay, there are my slides. Wonderful. So let's get started. Just a quick introduction to myself and Policy Link. So like I said, I'm a senior associate at Policy Link. We are a national research and action institute that works on advancing racial and economic equity. And our focus, the population that we focus on are the 100 million residents in the United States who are economically insecure. I want to start off with a bit of data around the rental market in Maryland and in the region that you are governing in. So I'm not sure if folks have seen the most recent National Low Income Housing Coalition report, but if you have seen it, you know that there are very few places left in the United States for minimum wage workers to reasonably afford housing. What this research shows is that stable housing is out of reach for thousands of renters in Maryland. In order to afford a typical 2-bedroom apartment working minimum wage, a worker would have to either work 93 hours a week or work 2.3 full-time jobs. So what that tells us is that most of our renters in Maryland are cost burdened, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. I also want to point to some housing data in Prince George's County. I think that it's really important to think about our entire housing spectrum from homeownership to rental. And this just lays out a bit of the inequities in homeownership, and specifically the racial homeownership gap in Prince George's County. So as you can see here, Latino households are much less likely to be owning their home. And in general, communities of color are less likely to own their home. And what that means is that when we talk about renters, we are talking about a population that is disproportionately people of color, right? And so I want to uplift that just to center the fact that housing justice is racial justice. And we are talking about renter issues. We are talking about issues that disproportionately impact people of color. So I just want to center that idea. And then looking more specifically at renters here, this is a graph that shows the housing cost burden in Prince George's County. So for those who are earning below 200% of the poverty line, what we see is that the vast majority of renters across race, right, are experiencing high cost burden. Across the entire county, 85% of households are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And I think this leads well into a conversation about what are the benefits of a well-tailored rent stabilization policy. Before we do that, just want to take a moment to clarify between rent stabilization and rent control. Sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, but I do want to set some context that when I am talking about rent control, I am referring to kind of the more academic definition, which is like first generation rent control or rent regulations. And so these are policies that are more strict in the way that they regulate rent increases. They often have dollar amount caps or regulate rent increases through price ceiling. So saying, rent cannot exceed this dollar amount in any given year. And when I'm talking about rent stabilization, what I'm referring to is more of what we think of as second generation rent regulations or modern rent control, because I know that many people still use that term when talking about what I interpret as rent stabilization. So these are policies that are much more flexible, right? They restrict how much landlords are allowed to increase rent annually, but there's no dollar amount that is associated with the cap. It's more of a percentage, and that's what we've been seeing in the past few decades, and very much so in the past few years. And I want to make this differentiation because it is important to point out the different impacts that they have on the housing ecosystem. So setting the stage, what is rent stabilization? So like I mentioned in the last slide, rent stabilization is a policy that sets maximum allowable rent increases so that we can prevent predatory and egregious rent hikes, which we know are more targeted towards low-income renters, renters of color, renters for whom English is not their first language, immigrants, refugees. Rent stabilization policies also, in the name, right, it stabilizes housing costs and makes it easier for renter households to afford their housing costs over a long period of time because there's a bit of predictability. Again, provides consistent and predictable rent increases so people can actually plan financially. And it protects against the destabilizing effects of displacement. It also prevents the constant cost of tenant turnover because we know that is also a cost that property owners bear. And of course, they reduce sudden evictions because a $200-300 rent hike can turn into an economic eviction for a family. Some rent stabilization policies, and they're different across the country, some establish a rent board that serves as a mediator between landlords and tenants, and that helps level the playing field between landlords and tenants. And then some rent stabilization policies also create rental registries. And this is a really important element because in most cities and states across the United States, there's very little transparency and information collection around who owns housing, what housing stock do we have, and having a rental registry not only helps us do that, but in doing so, we are able to better track trends and patterns in our housing market. So why rent stabilization? a few big picture reasons, right? Like I said, housing justice is racial justice. Low-income renters and renters of color are most impacted by egregious rent increases. A big piece of this too is closing the racial homeownership and wealth gap. We know that homeownership is a great pathway to building wealth if that is what a household chooses. And what better way to help a household achieve homeownership than to stabilize rent so that the amount that they would have spent towards an egregious rent hike could actually go towards their down payment assistance so they can achieve homeownership. A big piece of rent stabilization is that it also prevents displacement and homelessness, which we know are growing issues. And bigger picture, rent stabilization also slows down the growth of corporate landlord consolidation in our housing market. I think a lot of us saw in the post-foreclosure crisis that many corporate landlords or private equity firms started swooping in to communities and buying up single-family homes, and essentially taking those single-family homes out of the hands of potential homeowners, first-time homeowners, and using those single-family rentals as a way to extract wealth from our communities. And many of those corporate landlords use predatory and egregious rent hikes, evictions, and massive fees as profit collection strategies. And so when we implement strategies like rent stabilization, we're able to disincentivize that type of predatory behavior and disincentivize their further buy-up of our housing market. And of course, I think the most important piece is that rent stabilization is a piece of the puzzle and a piece of one really important part of the toolkit that we need in terms of many housing policies and many strategies to address our affordable housing crisis. We do need to build more deeply affordable housing. We do need increased tenant protections. We do need advance notice. We do need a rental registry. We do need increased safety and inspections so that we can get better quality housing. And amidst all of that, what we also need to do is make sure that people who have access to housing can maintain that access to housing and not be economically displaced. So rent stabilization is a really key piece of that puzzle. It provides immediate protections. And so while it takes 2-3 years to build, right? The development process is long. There are many factors that can delay the completion of a project. And so in the meantime, rent stabilization can make sure that folks who are currently in housing can stay in housing. A few more reasons why rent stabilization is effective. It addresses the crisis at scale. Very few policies can protect entire populations, and rent stabilization does that. If you design a policy that covers all renters, the day it becomes active and in effect, every renter is protected. And it's very cost effective as well. We think about how much it costs to build a new unit of housing. That's anywhere between $250,000 to $500,000. And there are many people who need immediate help. And so as we are building that housing, rent stabilization is a very cost effective way to provide protections for thousands of households. And I will kind of breeze through this piece, but many economic benefits of housing stability. Here's a really great example. If we eliminated rent burden for every renter household in Prince George's County, we would be kind of liberating over $440 million in local dollars that renter households could be spending in our economy. And what this means is if we made sure that every renter household only spent 30% of their income, I apologize for the background noise. If every renter only paid 30% of their income on housing, this means that there would be across the county an additional $400 million circulating in the local economy. And here's another way to look at that. So each household would have, the green bar here is how much money a household would have in disposable income if they were not rent burdened. That's an additional $24,000, right? Over 20,000 households. And those dollars could be going towards, like I said, down payment assistance. It could be towards, groceries. It could go towards children's educations, college savings, starting a small business. All of these dollars are dollars that could be stimulating the local economy and improving people's lives. And I will skip through these for the sake of time, but we know there are many health benefits to housing stability, as well as community benefits related to education, social connection, and as well as social capital. So next I want to touch on where rent stabilization is working. I think that's a really important piece to uplift because we can talk about the benefits, but we want to know where it's working now. So this might be shocking to some people. I know it was shocking when I first heard it. There are over 180 cities in the United States that have rent stabilization laws in place. Over 180 cities. We don't often hear that. I think more often than not, we hear the false rhetoric of it failing in one or two cities, but we don't hear about the fact that it is helping over 180 cities thrive. In 2019, both Oregon and California passed statewide rent regulations. That was huge. And between 2020 and 2022, so just within the last 3 years, 5 cities have passed rent stabilization laws in the United States, either through city council action or through ballot initiative. And I think a really important piece of this is that rent stabilization has had a long history in the United States. It started as rent control during the post World War II period, and it has, evolved over time. But the great thing about a long history of this policy is that it is also constantly evolving, and we can learn from cities as they are developing policies so that we cannot make, so we can choose not to make the same mistakes in policy design as they have. So, for example, many cities within the last few years have switched from their previous formula, which is using inflation as a measure for annual rent increases, and have actually gone back within the last few years during this time of high inflation and added additional safety measures. And I'll touch on that in a little bit. I think cities are also recognizing that new construction exemptions can be harmful and that they create dual and competing housing markets in cities. And so cities more and more are either trying to limit new construction exemptions, get rid of them, or make the time period shorter. And then what research has shown for a long time is that vacancy decontrol is a very strong incentive for tenant eviction when other tenant protections, such as just cause, are not in place. And then lastly, I touched on this with new construction exemptions, but any type of exemption around type of building or type of owner, all that does is put more people at risk of not being covered and therefore creating dual housing markets in our cities, where one half of people are protected and the other half are not. Here are some examples of recent rent stabilization policies across the country. I want to show you the most recent because I think they best incorporate the learnings that people have picked up along the way as the policy has evolved. So Oakland, California has a policy where the annual rent cap is either 60% of CPI or 3%, whichever is lower. Richmond has the same policy. Santa Ana, California has a policy that is 80% of CPI or 3%, whichever is lower. Pasadena has a cap that is 75% of CPI. The city of Perth Amboy in New Jersey has a cap that is 3%, or if the tenant also pays the water bill, 2.5%. And then Portland, Maine has a policy that caps the annual rent increase at 70% of CPI. And of course, all of these policies have exemptions processes, right? They vary from city to city and state to state, but there is always a pathway for a property owner to request an exemption if that cap is not enough. And I feel like that's an important point to include. So as we have learned over the years, there are some principles that should be centered for effective rent stabilization policies. And the top 3 are that we should ensure maximum coverage of rental homes. That means we want to cover as many people as possible. For example, minimizing exemptions and making sure that the rent stabilization protections are in place across tenancies. And by that, I mean enforcing vacancy control. The second piece is pairing rent stabilization or rent control policies with robust tenant protections and systems to maintain safe, quality housing. And by that, I mean pairing rent stabilization with just cause policies, pairing rent stabilization with advance notice, pairing rent stabilization with rental registries, all creating this larger ecosystem of safe and accountable housing for renters and property owners. And then lastly, maximizing neighborhood stability. We know that a change that happens every year can add up quite quickly, right? Let's say you're paying $1,000 in rent, and for some reason the rent cap is 10%. That is nowhere near enough, because that means that every year rent is increasing at least $100 a month. And for most households, that increase is not something they can adapt to without making sacrifices, whether those sacrifices are in healthcare or education or utilities, right? We know that we have to choose a percentage that is actually sustainable for the wage conditions that renters are experiencing. Service industry and industries that renters are more likely to be employed in are definitely not seeing anywhere near 10% rent increases, just using that as an example. And then the last two things I'll touch on, I know there's going to be many questions, so I encourage you all to write them down, email them to me. One common question is, what's the impact on development? I think the most important thing to remember is that when investors and developers get started on a development, they create a real estate pro forma, right? And what they do is they write down all the costs to build the housing and the ways that they're going to collect money to make a return. And those are, the very basic pieces of a pro forma. And what's important is that when investors can set initial rents, they can then project their cash flow, right? This usually, developers tend to do 10 or 20-year cash flows, usually 10-year cash flows. And when they do that, they can set the rent at a level they need to ensure that, as costs increase over time, and their rent increases can also grow over time so that they may cover those costs. Now, the important thing about rent stabilization is that it does not interfere with the ability for investors to set initial rent. And so they can set initial rent at wherever they need to ensure a projection of cash flow that pencils out, essentially. And that is a really critical piece of rent stabilization, because developers are still able to set rent where they need to satisfy any banking or lender or investor requirements. This policy only impacts rent increases following the determination of initial rent. So that means if I am a developer planning a project in a city with rent stabilization, I can set my rent growth over time as whatever that cap is. So there's a predictable amount that I can depend on. And, that's different from rent control policies, where there's more likely to be a dollar amount cap. And that's much more difficult for a developer to plan out their financial future with, because they won't be able to get past an actual dollar amount. So in that sense, rent stabilization is a much better policy because it includes the flexibility of cost changing over time. And then secondly, I want to touch upon this other question, which is 3% enough? I chose 3% because that is the number that we've been seeing very recently in policies across the country. And I just want to put a little bit into perspective, what 3% is, right? So I have two real life examples here. I think commonly people think of, property taxes and utilities as rising costs when it comes to operating housing. So this first example is a 20-unit apartment building that currently has rent set at $1,500 a month. With a 3% annual increase in rent, rents would increase $45 per unit per month. And when we add all of that up, a 3% rent increase means an additional annual rental income of $10,800 for the building. So 3% may seem small because we think 2 or 3, that's just just a few, right? But when we apply that to the amount of money that renters are paying and the cost of housing, 3% can actually be very significant. So that's one example. The next is an example of utilities. I know that across the country, folks are seeing increased heating costs, water costs, various utilities. And so let's put that into perspective. Let's say rent is $1,100, and of that $1,100 a month, $50 of it goes towards a utility. If the price of the utility increased by 50%, right, that's a very significant jump, 50%, then the utility cost would be $75. That would mean a $25 rent increase. And when we translate that into a percentage, that is a 2.27% rent increase. So all that to say, when that utility goes up 50%, the rent only goes up 2.27. And I think that is a really important example of, when we think about the percentages, they seem very small. When we apply them, we just see the practical example. And the last thing I'll say about that is that proportionality really matters, right? If a certain cost is jumping by 10, 20, 30%, that doesn't mean rent has to increase by 10, 20, 30%. It means that rent has to increase by the amount at which that cost counts towards the rent. And I know there'll be many other questions, but I want to make sure to keep this relatively short to respect your time. Again, thank you so much for the opportunity to share this presentation with you all. Thank you, Councilmember Mitchell, for inviting me. And I have my email address here, trom@policylink.org, if folks want to share any questions. I hope to see you all in a future meeting, probably virtually since I am based in the Twin Cities, to answer any additional questions and to support you as you move towards, leading in Maryland in terms of protecting renters who are a vital part of your community. So thank you again for letting me join, and I look forward to meeting you all in the future.
All right. Can I ask if any council members have any questions? Submit them to the clerk for that presentation, and we'll get that over to Trom. Thank you for that presentation. I'm gonna move down the list. I'm gonna call on Grayson Wiggins. All right.
How about now? Good
Yeah.
evening. Can I approach? Is that okay to hand you some documents here?
Sure.
I always like to ask before I approach. So good evening. My name is Grayson Wiggins, an attorney here in the state of Maryland. Here on behalf of the Maryland Multi-Housing Association. I tell you, I would love to go to LA and make movies and videos and send them in. It'd be great. Just to testify from afar. So I represent the Maryland Multi-Housing Association. It is a statewide trade association for owners and managers of rental property, both large. The association includes members that house around 10 to 15% of the state's population, give or take a couple percent. It's over 600,000 people in the state of Maryland. And so I wanted to give a little background on this policy and just kind of generally the state of affairs in landlord-tenant world here in the state of Maryland. So I'm going to start by just talking a little bit because I know I got a chance to watch the Facebook link from Councilman Mitchell last weekend, and he had a gentleman speak, and I want to talk a little bit about that as well. So just to be clear, are have plummeted. In Prince George's County, on a monthly average, so that the average number of victims in Prince George's County on a given month have declined I think it's 75% this year as compared to 2019. It's not on the document that you have here. That's data from the Maryland Judiciary. And so I also want to talk about some of the recent tenant benefits that have been enacted at the state level. And I've talked to some of you about this. There's an access to counsel program now that will provide state-funded and free attorneys to tenants in rent court processes. There's a new 10-day notice that was enacted, took effect back October 2021. That is one of the longest grace periods in the country. Essentially what that does is it says that the landlord has to give you a 10-day notice before an action is filed to collect the rent. It is longer than every jurisdiction that touches Maryland, that borders Maryland, except for the state of Pennsylvania. It's there. You have Maryland is unique in that tenants can pay and stay and not usually have to pay the full amount that is owed to redeem their right to the property. So you can pay a smaller amount than what is owed. And in Prince George's County, of all the jurisdictions in the state of Maryland, has had some of the longest court process delays and rent court delays in the state and in, I would say, the country. There was periods of time in Prince George's County where if you stop paying rent day one of a year-long lease, then you would not have a court hearing to collect that rent until after the lease was done. So that's what landlords have been dealing with here in Prince George's County from a court perspective. Now I want to talk a little bit about rent control. And the woman who spoke before me spoke more generally and more about some national issues and things like that. I want to talk about Maryland. I want to talk about Laurel. And I want to talk about the history of rent control in this state. So as many of you may know, rent control started in Montgomery County, 1970s. They tried it for 4 years. It was generally a failure. They tried it again from 79 to 81. According to research from Towson University, property values fell substantially. No new units were constructed or planned for development. So that's what rent control generally is. You're going to find that if you institute it, development will slow to a halt over time. Additionally, you're going to lose rental units. So for example, and this is on the document in front of you, following enactment of rent control up in Cambridge and Brookline, Massachusetts, the amount of rental properties fell by 8% and 12% respectively. In Berkeley, California, and Berkeley, they dropped 14% and again 8% in Santa Monica. Now I want to quickly divert to Tacoma Park because we hear a lot about Tacoma Park. It's the only jurisdiction in the state of Maryland that has rent control. They attach it to the CPI. In Tacoma Park, and Councilman Mitchell has talked about the development aspect of Tacoma Park. So to be clear, since Tacoma Park enacted rent control, there have been no new apartments built in Tacoma Park. City admits that. It's in a report that they had authored. They paid someone to author. And Councilman Mitchell tells you that he's told me, well, it's a population density issue, built out. Silver Spring, Maryland borders Tacoma Park to its northwest. Silver Spring, Maryland is 21% more dense than Tacoma Park, Maryland. Silver Spring, Maryland continuously and steadily has apartment communities built. So we find that in other communities. Go back to Cambridge, go back to Berkeley and surrounding areas. While those jurisdictions are losing rental properties, others are gaining them. Tacoma Park, based on census data, cross-referenced with a University of Maryland study, appears to have lost more than 20% of its rental units since it enacted rent control. 20% or more of its rental units are gone forever. How does that benefit renters? I find it hard to believe that renters are benefited by disappearing rental properties. They're being built next door in a more densely populated area. Candidly, I don't buy the argument that Tacoma Park is built out. The data just doesn't support it. So we see the impact. They're continuing to lose rental units. College Park, Maryland recognized that. They had rent control for 10 years. One of the stated purposes of their rent control policy was of rental. Renting the single family homes, creating too many issues. They wanted to put a stop to it. So they Where's it at? Construction, rent control could be endorsed to achieve this goal and may be considered preferable to exclusionary zoning. It's more effective than just excluding the apartments from your jurisdiction. And so you're we really, almost every jurisdiction we look at. I mean, San Francisco had a 50% reduction in the treated rental housing or rent controlled housing. It is it's a policy that consistently results in lost rental housing. In Maryland, outside of Montgomery County, which twice where it didn't go well, to say the least. Tacoma Park had it, College Park had it for a bit to get rid of rentals. And then somewhat recently, you had jurisdictions in Maryland adopted as part of the COVID response. It's an emergency situation. Maryland General Assembly, there's been a rent control bill. It's not an emergency rent control bill. It would be statewide and permanent. It's been introduced the last couple of years. It gets reviewed. It has not yet moved anywhere. But as an emergency protocol, 9 jurisdictions here in Maryland adopted emergency rent control policies. None of those jurisdictions continue to have those policies. Every one of them chose to discontinue the policy when they had the opportunity. And what's interesting is Prince George's County, one of those jurisdictions. Prince George's County had emergency rent control policy. And if you look at data on market rents during that time in Prince George's County, it was from July 2020 to 2021. Market rents went up 12.2%. One of the fastest growing times the county has seen recently. And it was while it had rent control. Rent control ended November 13th, 2021. So from an analysis perspective, when you look at the increase from July 2020 to October 2021, set aside November because it included both. And then you look at December 21 to November 2022, which is the most recent data that I've seen, rents only increased 3.4%. So you have a direct correlation here between increased rapidly market rents and rent control policy. I think that's pretty stark. Again, the jurisdictions chose not to extend the policy, and for good reason. If you look at the document here, so we previously talked about previously talked about new construction and a bit about existing housing. So you're going to hear a lot about, landlords just don't want to be regulated, right? They oppose it. They don't want to be regulated. So I want to read you something. Within the field of economics, there is broad agreement that rent control and stabilization laws produce negative economic consequences. That's the Montgomery County Office of Legislative Oversight. They have, when you talk, it's not the landlords. It's the counties have looked at this. The economists agree. They universally agree that rent control is a policy that does not work. Now, we can call it, look, I can slap a Ferrari sticker on my Chevy, but it's still a Chevy. And so we can call it rent control. We can call it rent stabilization. The Montgomery County policy from 79 to 81 had a rent control cap of 7.6%, hard cap of 10. I mean, you've got hard caps, you've got soft caps. 1973 and 1977, the rent control percent. Policies didn't work. Sound very similar to what Councilman Mitchell is proposing today. So you've got existing housing issues. Talked about the Stanford, the study led by Stanford and UC Berkeley economists that looked at San Francisco. Towson University said, if the intention of rent control policy is to provide affordable housing options for residents, this type of policy does not achieve that goal, as evidenced by findings from both East Coast and West Coast cities in the United States. Again, Towson University is not a landlord. They're neutral, they're third party, they're objective, they're reviewing the policies. Rent control has been found to accelerate gentrification in California's rent-controlled cities by driving out the poor and elderly. San Francisco study noted that as well. They found that it was contrary to the goal and increased gentrification. Other studies have found generally that higher income earners, when you install rent control, the higher income tenants tend to find the properties and reside in the properties. It's again, a consistent finding. We talked about the new construction. So Washington, D.C., we've talked about St. Paul. So St. Paul, HUD data, compared 2021 to 2022 permits. St. Paul, Minnesota instituted a 3% rent control. They voted on it in November 2021. So housing permits in St. Paul, Minnesota this year, from January to October, comparing them to the previous year, they did not have rent control. In St. Paul, Minnesota, permits fell 52.1%. Next door in Minneapolis, which does not have rent control, permits increased 160.67%. So you have one city that borders another. One that does not have rent control sees a significant increase in construction. One that does have rent control sees a significant reduction immediately. We've covered Tacoma Park. We'll talk about property taxes. So Laurel relies upon property taxes pretty heavily. Its total revenue budget for FY 2022, 67% of the budget was derived from real property tax revenue. So your budget, the ability to offer services, the ability to employ individuals in the city of Laurel is going to be tied closely to your total, the revenue you get from the real property tax. Studies have consistently found that real property tax assessments fall precipitously under rent control. So I just want to, researchers from Towson studied Montgomery County and found that if they were to institute rent control, there would have been a 10-year total tax revenue loss of $538.5 million. And that by 2025, the county would experience an annual tax revenue loss of $101 million. These are significant numbers. These are numbers that impede upon a jurisdiction's ability to continue to offer the same services it is currently offering to its residents. Studies in New York City and New Jersey have found the same. Studies in Massachusetts have underscored the negative impact that rent control has on property tax revenue. Cities in Massachusetts that ended rent control, in fact, experienced an immediate residential property tax revenue. And then there's a chart here from below. This is actually from the Towson study. What it does is on the right side is the non-Tacoma Park properties in Montgomery County, and on the left are the Tacoma Park properties. And so you can see that when Montgomery County ended rent control and Tacoma Park kept it, how the properties increased in comparison. I do want to talk a little bit about the previous presentation that we heard as well. So there were claims that rent control advances equity. As I noted, there are studies from California that show that rent control accelerates gentrification. There are studies in California that show that that rent control, in fact, causes inequity. When when renters who make larger sums of money on an annual basis, properties move in and remain there. There was a claim that that rent control helps cities rental markets or rental stock thrive or helps their look at places and data from percent housing stock, helping the city's housing stock thrive. I just don't look at specific studies, both from inside Maryland and outside of Maryland. There is consistent data that you pre-tax revenue loss. It just from an overall perspective, I don't see how you look at any of that and say this is what makes a jurisdiction thrive. Additionally, I know on Saturday at the previous one, there was another individual who spoke, who made an interesting, I thought interesting comment. They were speaking and giving a presentation in support of rent control. I think this was in the Public Justice Center, and they indicated, they claimed that a couple of things that you should not. The gist of it was, and forgive me, I'm not going to be able to quote the gentleman. What the general gist seemed to be, don't listen to the studies that the landlords listen to, just enact rent control because we think. And then he admitted that they lack data. That was a statement that individual made, that they have a lack of data. I believe he also claimed that Towson University was the only study on rent control in Maryland. That's incorrect. University of Maryland has studied Tacoma Park. There's another study, I believe, from the year 2000 as well. So, and then you talk about, there was a discussion a little bit about the economic impact of rent control. I want to be clear, like when you talk about cost burdens and things like that, Montgomery County looked at this on a bill dealing with rent control on the red line and found that the economic offset just isn't there. Rent control will have a negative economic impact on the jurisdiction in which it is enacted. That's been found time and time again. And so, these are all things to consider. I think personally that you, and both professionally, that you have better options. I think there are things like local housing vouchers. There are other policies that can be put in place that don't depress the rental market, that don't result in real property tax losses, that don't result in lost apartments, and it can benefit people here in Laurel, renters most definitely included. We've sent the DHCD housing report, which goes through a lot of options and has a toolkit in it. It talks about a number of different policy options that can help with these, help improve the city's rental housing market. And again, we would be happy to work towards those goals, but rent control has just been proven time and time again to be a policy that does not work. We can call it whatever we want to. We can try and attempt. It's not even really reframing it, because a lot of this stuff that's being proposed here has been proposed in other jurisdictions or has even been enacted here in Maryland and had negative economic consequences. And so with that, I mean, again, we'll be happy to work as partners on to improve the city's housing market on the number of different options that are enumerated in both the DHCD report and, like I said, any type of potential housing voucher or something like that. But we simply cannot support rent control. It's a policy that too many economists, too many researchers, too many universities, too many people have looked at, reviewed real consequences and theoretical, and deemed it to be a policy that doesn't work. And with that, Mr. Council President.
Any questions from the council for Mr. Wiggins?
Oh, I have a
Before we
couple
move on to,
for him.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, I got a couple. Mr. Wiggins, I believe during the time that the rent evictions declined,
the dates that you mentioned was when we were in a pandemic. And the judicial system in the state of Maryland, including Prince George's County, was either going virtual or they had no services at all.
The dates that I
So it
mentioned-
was all, hold on, let me ask my question, let me finish my statement. So to get an eviction, it's sanctioned by the Prince George's County Sheriff's Department, and you have to go to Upper Marlboro and you have to put in the proper paperwork.
Correct.
And doing that cost landlords a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of things to do. That's why the eviction rate during those periods of time that you stated went way down, or down. Wait till now that the emergency rent stabilization bill by Prince George's County is now over, and wait until wait till the court systems are back in full, and they're getting back in full service now. So we're going to see a sharp increase in those evictions.
Okay, so to respond, the timelines that I gave you were when the courts were open. They were after the rent stabilization bill had ended. Rent stabilization bill's been over.
I said after the rent stabilization, but not during the pandemic. They weren't.
The data that
They were not open.
The data that I cited to you was after the rent stabilization bill had ended.
Yes, that's okay. It's going to go up. It's going to
It
go
was
up
while
from there
courts were
because the courts were not open completely, and you know that they either were going Zoom meetings or and it was too much of a bother for them to even go and apply for it. So they just waited it out. And that's why there weren't a lot of evictions at the time, because they didn't go apply for the evictions. I talked to the sheriff's department about the whole thing, and that's what they said. And now it's going to increase immensely.
Okay, so I talked to my clients in the district court, and the easiest stat that undercuts your argument there is that filings are down.
Absolutely, and the filings were down, and the sheriff's department didn't have enough personnel to serve the evictions.
No, you're talking about
because there were so many of them.
I'm talking about the filings, the initial filing to get into court. You're saying the writs. I'm telling you the initial filings were down. So
But that's why
if your
they're
claim
down.
is that the issue is the writs, that would be undercut by the fact that the filing, the initial filing that has nothing to do with the sheriff's office, are down. They've also dropped precipitously during this time.
Okay, that's fine. I'm telling you. But now wait till now that the courts are getting back to full service, getting back to the eviction part, and the sheriff's department is still shorthanded. So it's going to be a while before these evictions are even served.
And I can tell you that we have heard that from advocacy groups they use that to push a number of different policies.
And listen to you say rent control, and that's the way most lobbyists say rent control. We're looking for rent stabilization.
Okay, what I'm
where
telling
it's a certain percentage. Hold on. Let me talk. Okay. And your job as a lobbyist, you get paid a lot of money to work for rent companies, and we know that.
Ad hominem now?
And your job is to show all the negativities of rent stabilization. You don't care. And your companies don't care about people not being able to afford their rent or anything. And you like this word control. What we say is it's the landlords are going to lose their control on whenever they want to raise the rent. Yet you keep throwing this rent control in there at us like we want to jump in there and we want to control these landlords, which we don't want to do. All we want to do is protect our citizens from predatory landlords and corporations that come in there and raise their rents 30, 40, and 50%. And to do that and to prevent future predatory landlords from coming in there and corporations, you have to have an ordinance. You have to have laws prohibiting that, or it'll continue on and on and on and on. And maybe if you get that ordinance, if these predatory landlords and corporations see that we have this rent stabilization, maybe they'll go somewhere else, because we don't need them in Laurel. And I explained that to you, how rich our community is, how we don't have a housing market dilemma in Laurel. We have actually three current or two current large constructions going on right now with housing. And we have 3 that we've already approved that's just waiting. And the only reason they're delaying is because of the high price of construction work. So our housing market isn't bad. It's not bad. We don't need help in the housing market. What we need help in is the affordable housing market, which we don't have.
Got it. So you attacked me, but it's interesting. Yeah. So, oh, no, it wasn't. So it's interesting that you bring up ad hominem comments. So it's interesting because, one, let me clarify that my clients do care about people. But two, let me just note this. You made an interesting comment, and that is that my job is to bring up the negative impacts of rent control. And you're right that so you're right that there are negative impacts, which I have highlighted, you have not responded to. You've instead just tried to paint me as some fly-by-night person when I'm not. These are not my opinions. I didn't go to Stanford or UC Berkeley. These are economists from those prestigious institutions. You have additional research from Towson. This isn't me. This isn't my comments signed Grayson Wiggins. These are exceptionally bright individuals. You have an individual from MIT who did a study that found that property values are suppressed under rent control. Not only the properties that are controlled by the government, but the ones that neighbor them in the communities. And I brought this up to you, and your response to me was, well, I don't. When I brought up that your constituents are going to have their property values go down, your response to me was, in general, that's not something that you were worried about because the city of Laurel had all its tax dollars that it needed. How do you make a
We do.
comment
We
like
haven't
that?
had a tax rate increase in a very long time. We got a ton.
Well,
we
I'm-
have a lot of development in the pipeline
I'm glad that the city has what it needs. I hope
because we have great management
I hope
people in
the
our city,
constituents
and we can
who will have
manage
their
it.
property values, the value will be okay as well.
I told you that. We don't need that in Laurel.
All right. I'm going to move on to another council member. Does any other council member have a comment or question on Mr. Wiggins' presentation?
Yeah.
Councilman Mitchell?
Thank you very much, Mr. Wiggins. Just for full transparency, I not only, met Grayson at the landlord meeting, but we met outside of the landlord meeting at a local Laurel business. Of course, it's Sport Laurel, which is great.
It's good food.
It was great. It was great. But I would say that, of course, there's a lot of myths, and I could take time dispelling some of those myths because we went through that conversation. But I will say that none of the studies that you've presented talk about the socioeconomic benefits.
Incorrect.
It's in okay. I'll look back at it because I promise you I didn't receive the emails that of this data. So this was kind of the first time that I seen this Townsend study.
We did send you and just for full disclosure, and I'm making sure you got it,
Sure.
the list of studies as well, which go through some of that too. So.
I promise you, and I also want to share some studies as well. And so I will say that the thing about studies, right, is studies I feel can be skewed to a certain bias, right? Like I can present to you studies, from Minnesota or from the Urban Institute that might be skewed towards a certain positive bias or a positive light on rent stabilization. Of course, that's not something I think we would argue. I think the thing that I would argue is the people that make these studies, aren't the people that we're generally trying to affect, right? Like these are, generally scientists and economists and, these generally aren't the everyday workers or the grocery store cashier that we're trying to, keep living in this city or have the ability to afford to live in the city. Outside of that, the real thing was you said it wasn't about, control. Tacoma Park, the legislation I have right here, it says rent stabilization at the top. So I know semantics, right?
It's
Semantics. The biggest thing that I've had is like the conversation that we had at the end of the day, you guys don't want regulation. I understand that, right? I've talked to other landlord lobbyists. They're okay with some regulation, but you know what that regulation is, right?
Which one are you referring to?
Anti-rent gouging, price gouging.
Are you talking about the AOBA?
AOBA, yes, sure.
I saw it very recently. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, because even though we discussed it in the landlord meeting, right, partially on the provisions on the head, what it would look like.
We talked about it generally. We didn't have. There was, to your point, I think in the landlord meeting, there wasn't anything on paper that we had seen. So.
I understand.
Yeah.
But so the biggest difference I materially had, and I met with AOBA and Sons Management, was it wasn't about rent stabilization. It wasn't about rent control. It wasn't about anti-price gouging. It was the fact that they didn't like regulation, and if they were regulated, they wanted a double-digit rental cap without a process. That was.
Can I ask?
Sure.
So you're saying that moving forward, you're thinking rent gouging as opposed to rent control.
Absolutely. I like
Okay.
if we were to have a double-digit rent cap, there's no point in writing a bill. Like that's my position, and that was my position when I spoke to AOBA or Southern
You
Management.
don't support the AOBA thing.
No, I told them I support it if it was a single-digit rent cap, and that was the end of the conversation because they said they were looking for more of a double-digit, which would be 10, 15, 20%.
Apologies. I thought you were making the distinction because you were between us and them. Because you were saying that you were going to support their proposals. That's
No. I was just curious because multifamily homeowners and dwellings, they support no rental caps, no regulation, because of course they're not regulated now. And for AOBA, they would prefer price gouging, which I said is materially different. So
you don't support that.
I understand that, but now since you've recently read this, does your organization support this as well, or your clients?
We haven't had an opportunity. We have a whole process. When we get something like that, it's got to go through most associations work like this. It's got to go through a process. I don't make the unilateral.
No, I understand. Well, and so just about the process, have you gotten an answer about the grace periods? Because
Yes.
because the bill is just, it's not a grace period. Essentially, it's just you're getting evicted 10 days later. Like basically they'll send a notice 10 days later. It's not a grace period as we're talking about, and it can't be used every month, from my understanding.
So when you say grace period, sometimes you talk about the
for the late fees, before the late fees occur.
Because sometimes you talk about it and you talk about, and I'm just pointing this out that this is why I get confused sometimes, is because sometimes, and it's not just you, it's other people too. I get it, and it's because it's a landlord tenant stuff. Not everybody is up on the statutes. So sometimes we talk about grace period, and it's the grace period to pay rent, like a notice period, the one that they enacted 2 years ago. Sometimes we talk about grace periods, and people talk about the late fee. So the late fee aspect, my client has informed me. So the proposal you guys had, I think, was 15 days, right, to match it with the bank. Is that accurate? Is that
like mortgages and yes.
Yeah. So my understanding is that the state statute, the mortgage late fee is 10% and the rental late fee is 5%. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is.
Okay. So, and my understanding, and I think we can all stipulate here, is that a landlord is not a bank. Mortgages are through banks. Landlords are not banks, generally. And that landlords have a mortgage. They need to have the property, they need to have the rent before the mortgage is due, especially when the tenant is paying a lower late fee than the mortgagee, right? And so we would have to see a proposal from you on a time frame inside of that 15 days before we could agree to anything.
I got you. So I'll definitely come to that, because maybe 10 days, 12 days. Maybe we're somewhere in that range.
I'm always happy to go back to that wonderful restaurant that had the great food and have additional conversations, for sure.
Absolutely. And I guess one of the things I wanted to say is, of course, we talked about Tacoma Park. One of the things I will just say materially, geographically, Silver Spring is bigger. Like it's actually a larger,
but it's denser. So
sure.
Initially, you said that they don't build in Tacoma Park because it's too dense.
Yes, but then I also said they have redeveloped, and that was one of the things I clarified in our meeting.
Can you clarify that? Because in my research, again, I mentioned that they've lost rental housing.
Sure.
There's a cloudburst report from, which notes that I believe the government had to outspend the private sector 2-1 just to preserve 700 units over the course of almost 20 years. And so the government had to outspend the city 2-1, had to outspend the private sector. And that includes federal and state, don't get me wrong, but you had to outspend it 2-1 just to prevent a loss of even higher than 20%. At that point, you'd be talking north of 25, almost 30 maybe. I'd have to run the numbers again because I don't want to do that in my head and say a wrong number. But so I mean, is that that's the only redevelopment thing that I've ever seen? And we contacted the city of Tacoma Park, their housing department, and asked, can you account for the private sector funds that were expended during that time frame? And we were given 2 sentences that it was, it looked like maybe some nonprofit type funding, and then banks was what we heard that give the loan to affordable housing. That's the in-depth nature we got from the numbers, because private sector could be a number of things. And so when you say redevelop, like preserve, like that means maintain in my mind. Sure. I don't think that they were, I haven't seen any evidence at least that they were knocking down and building a new apartment community. I mean, the city's report indicates that.
Sure. And of course, we can continue this conversation because, you know, I have a very good relationship with, you know, the former mayor and now councilwoman, very, very, very pro stabilization. And I want to just say that, you know, the people elevated her, right? Like she was so much for the people, they elevated her to a higher seat. But I understand.
I was just gonna say, if you can contact her and get the actual like breakdown of that number, that would be helpful too.
I promise you I'll call her this week. And from my understanding, I could also call Councilmember Jawando because some of that redevelopment actually came from the county as well. I forget the organization. It was either like Thrive Montgomery or another nonprofit that they work with to redevelop, not just maintain, but also the question that I initially asked you was about the development and like where development could occur in this dense population rich area. Or not rich area, right?
Yeah, so in my mind, when I said the development, what I based on the research I've done is includes like if there's an open field,
Sure.
right, and you need an open field and you go build it out there, but it also includes knocking something down and building something up.
Sure.
I mean,
sure.
the study, I mean, the city's report seems to be very clear on that.
Okay.
So if you have information to the contrary, we'd love to see it because the city report indicates that, census data indicates that they're losing rental units. Where are these properties?
Well, the one thing I was going to say and to point out is like, you know, I've of course been in Montgomery County. I know that Tacoma Park is one of the most cost affordable areas to live in Tacoma Park. Right. And so, you know, as I talk about the socioeconomic values, I talk about like the community not being displaced from, of course, the inability to pay rent due to the rising rent costs. Right. And so Tacoma Park, a lot of people don't leave those apartments. And for a fact, a lot of people don't leave their homes. Like if you think about the amount of turnover in Tacoma Park, there isn't a great amount. Like it's one of the most politically diverse and rich areas.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I'd have to see the data on that because to me, losing 20% of your housing stock, your rental housing stock would be displacement.
Sure.
Any other comments for Mr. Wiggins? Councilman Sindhu?
I don't have a question, Mr. Wiggins. I got a suggestion though.
Okay.
Once I can wait.
Okay.
Call you next speaker.
We got one more.
Okay, I can wait till
I
after
guess
next
that's
speaker.
it for now. If we have
I
any
have
more.
one more question. Mr. Wiggins, the other question I asked you was how many of your clients live in the city of Laurel?
I see. I didn't take that as a serious question, to be candid. Because
No, it was serious.
I responded back that how many of the tenants that you were working with live in Laurel, and you said you're not going to get me with that.
Well, I mean, I could now tell you that there's many tenants. There's many tenants that have signed petition signatures, several hundred, and there's several ones that I've worked with outside of the areas that we've highlighted. But you know, I can sit down and give you some tenants' names if you would like that list. We can compare lists.
Be happy to sit down.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Wiggins. Any questions or comments later, we'll just submit them to you and see if we have an answer. Thank you. last on our list, we have Ryan Washington from Ioba. He can come.
Good evening, members of the council. Thank you for inviting me today. I don't have much to say as Grayson provided a comprehensive and detailed presentation. But just a little background, AOBA represents about 67,000 rental units in Prince George's County. We've spoken to each and every one of you just on just some of the other alternatives that isn't focused on rent stabilization. But I don't have anything else further to say this evening, and I would like to stay for any questions members may have.
Well, you guys did a proposal, which you guys, well, I want to say you guys, which you emailed to me about was it anti-price gouging? You guys set a number at 20%. Why?
That was a number that the consensus to our members and just the data that we out together, that 20%, that was the starting point number. And like I said, this was just a working draft. And I'm open.
No, I'm not ridiculing. I just want to know, like, was it because it was hard to fluctuate if it was lower, or was that just what you guys were comfortable with?
Well, that the 20% that may include costs like the revitalization of properties, renovation, market trends, inflation, all that taking account of that percentage. So a lot of our members deem 20% to be appropriate. But like I said, we're willing to work, but 20% was the ideal number.
And this is just me again, roughly. And this is not a consensus of the council. Just me asking, if we even took that route and we did a 15% or a 10%, how would you guys feel?
I have to go back to my membership and ask. That's something that I deliberate on, have that conversation with. But I know there was strong support.
Other comments or questions from the council?
Yes, a few. Ryan, I guess I'll start off where I ended. How many of your clients live in the city of Laurel?
I don't have that number, but we do have quite a few properties that operate in the city.
Sure. So we could work on that. So next time, we could work on that.
Absolutely, I'll figure out that number.
How many apartments or rental units does AOBA have in the city of Laurel?
I want to say between 6,000 and 10,000 units. I have to double check that number.
Okay. And I guess it's really not even a question, because as I said, I appreciate, the proposal, and of course, the landlord's taking the time, but essentially, it's no better than APAC at the federal level, where you guys give us a bill and tell us how to regulate you. At the end of the day, the conversation that I had with Grayson, the conversation that I had with Gabriella from Southern Management was that, like, it's unfair. It's unfair. And the reason it came down to that conversation was because they said, how about the grocery store, the sticker shock that we get? How about the gas station, the sticker shock that we get? Right? And my response was, I think I buy the same wheat loaf of bread at Giant. I promise you that it has increased during the pandemic with inflation. But at the end of the day, that is a minimal amount of my monthly earnings that I'm paying. Right, so we've already deemed affordable housing of what, like 30% of the 30% of the area median income, or not affordable housing. I'm sorry, I'm confusing my facts. But the bigger point that I was trying to make to Gabriella and to you guys was, like, rent is the biggest cost outside of healthcare. So that's why this is important. And the thought of, like, you coming to us with 20%. That's almost a slap in the face. There's no need to even regulate. I don't even think you guys should start at 10%. If you guys started at 10, we'd be a lot closer. Our proposal called for 3%. You guys already said on average you're doing 3.4. The mayor and administration, they call for 4% or 3/4 of CPI. So the thought is like we're right there in the middle upon what you guys are claiming to already do right now or currently.
So,
with exceptions.
with exceptions, I would say that with the CPI, and I believe the previous speaker spoke on it, that, that was one of the mistakes when they were trying to incorporate rent stabilization, was trying to use CPI,
Sure, because it got high. The rent got too damn high.
but it's not a good indicator. So, and what the studies show, and from my colleague quoted numerous studies that, going toward rent control and price gap, or just trying to regulate that altogether, isn't the appropriate route. Trying to put at a certain percentage doesn't help out.
But
Because
the
we don't
biggest
see
difference,
high
the
condo-
biggest difference is you guys want 20%, we want 3%. We can call it rent control. Well, how about if we call it rent stabilization at 20%? Would you guys be happy? Can we go home today?
Like I said, we presented a proposal. We're willing to work with the council on something that's amenable to both sides, and we're willing to work with stakeholders. Continue. That
Sure.
conversation.
That's no further questions.
All right, any other comments for Mr. Washington?
Again, just want to make sure everybody understands. The booklets that we put together were not our recommendations, they were discussion points. And when the administration sees what the council wants to do, we'll advise you of our position.
All right, I'm just gonna ask that, get out of here, that the council members, my colleagues, that we write a memo on what you support. I mean, you've heard today about rent stabilization. You've heard about anti-price gouging. Can you just send me a memo on what you're leaning towards? Just take a serious time and think, and just write a memo on what you more so support, whether it's even if it's nothing. But I'd like you to take your time and please just write a memo to me by December 31st. All right.
I'd like to go on record and make a statement, Mr. President, if possible.
Sure.
Yeah, I like to say we've been getting a lot of studies from both sides, but we haven't done a study on our city of Laurel. Haven't done a study yet. So I'm recommending that we do a study on our own for any multifamily units with 25 units or more and see what the average rent increase was from 2019 to 2021. I think it's important for us to have that data collected here in the city because we're getting data from all over the world. But what are we doing here in our own city? So I recommend the mayor's office and city council get together and do that study with multifamily units, 25 units or more inside the city of Laurel, and see what the average rent increase from 2018 to 2021 was. That will help us out in passing any legislation or coming to any numbers so we can see what the actual income is going on in our city. That's all. I'll make that statement on record. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ms. Councilman Sidnor.
Excuse me, how many apartments did you say? 25 or more?
Multifamily units with 25 more units.
25 or more units?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, there seems to be, I've seen some head shaking there. Just please include that in your memo if that's what you support. We're done. And I just want, if you have anything, any way you're leaning, I'm not asking. He didn't make a comment yet, sir. And I said, we're done. Again, I'm asking everyone to please write in a memo which way you're leaning, which way you support, what we're looking for, and we're gonna go from there. And
So yeah, at the end of the day, I said I wanted to put this on the record, and
Wow.